Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Logistics Rewired, Women in Supply Chain, a panel discussion. My name is Jessica Tessera. I'm a Director of Sales at Flexport, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar. I'm so excited to bring our panelists together and get the conversation started, but before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping items to go over. So on your screen, you will see a sidebar to the right of the main stage. If at any time you need technical assistance, please message us in the help chat located on the sidebar. You can also ask questions via the Q&A tab on the sidebar, and we will be taking a few questions from the audience at the end of the webinar, so be sure to get your questions in early. In the menu above your screen, you also have two tabs. In the first tab, you can register for Flexport's next webinar. Be sure to check that out. And in the second tab, there's a brief feedback survey for this webinar. We love feedback, so please fill that out before exiting the webinar. Lastly, a brief legal note. The information provided in our upcoming conversation is for general informational purposes only. All views and opinions expressed by the panelists are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Flexport or any other party affiliated with this webinar. And with that, I am excited to introduce our panel for today. We are chatting with three accomplished women in the supply chain industry, and I'd like to invite them to the stage now. First is Parisa Sadsida. Parisa is Flexport's Senior Vice President of SMB Product and Tech. Welcome, Parisa.
Hi.
Sabrina Carr, Director of Global Transportation at the Clorox Company. Hi, Sabrina.
Hello.
And Carol Kijak, the founder of Peripheral Vision LLC. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So before we jump into today's questions, we'll kick it off with some quick introductions. Parisa, let's start with you.
Sure, sounds good. I'm the leader of the small and medium-sized business segment at Flexport, and I actually just joined the company just over 3 months ago. I joined Flexport after 12 years at Amazon, where I worked on a bunch of different spaces across the company. But the key theme across what I did was that I was working on products and technology that enabled small businesses. And the last part of my time there was actually building out their last mile delivery service partner program. And so the idea of leveraging technology to empower small businesses has consistently been a driving force behind my career and what ultimately led me to join Flexport. And I will just say, I got into the logistics industry from a very non-traditional background. I have a journalism degree, which is kind of non-traditional for the business world as well. So I'm really passionate about opening the door for others, particularly women who come from a diverse set of backgrounds. So I'm excited to be here today and chat with this awesome crew.
Thanks, Parisa. Sabrina, why don't you go next?
So as you said, the Director of Global Transportation at Clorox. Been with Clorox for about 12 years. I'm home base is in the Atlanta area. I originally grew up in the Virgin Islands and made my way to Atlanta and just never left. I also have a non-traditional path. I fell into supply chain, and over the past 17 years, I've got a career across several disciplines within the supply chain. Ultimate goal is to be more of a supply chain professional, not necessarily just in transportation or one functional silo. That said, also have a passion for just opening the door and really helping people understand what supply chain has to offer, because as I said, I fell into it and I'm stuck here and I love it. So glad to be here.
Wonderful. And Carol?
Well, the common theme is, and I'm sure many people who are listening in on this webinar, is that they fell into it as well. So although I am back in the consulting arena right now, focusing on sales and business development strategies within commercial programs, I've had more than 30 years experience in logistics and supply chain. So the last position that I had was as Chief Commercial Officer, where my responsibilities included sales, account management, customer service, marketing, and 5 other functional areas. And I think, as you'll see today, Sabrina hit it right on, is that really my guess is that she's not just transportation. It does morph into a more supply chain focused role, which is exciting for those of us that have been doing this for a long time.
Great. Well, as I mentioned, we're so excited to have you 3 here today to share your expertise and experience working in the supply chain industry. So let's get to it. Our first question is for everyone on the panel. How have you seen the role of women in the supply chain industry change over the past few years? And what progress has been made and what more needs to be done? Sabrina, why don't we start with you? Actually, it looks like maybe we have a little technical difficulties. So maybe Carol, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, as I said that I've been doing this for over 30 years, it just occurred to me looking at Jessica. Oh, Sabrina's back. I will let her kick it off.
The one time that the computer glitches and I couldn't even tell you what happened. So how has the role of women in supply chain changed? So one, I go to several conferences and travel a lot within my role and have within several roles that I've been in. I think one notable change is the presence of women, especially in leadership positions as they're representing their companies at these supply chain conferences. So we've been in supply chain, but I think our presence in a leadership position and in leadership space and running different functions and different P&Ls, I think that's what I've seen change. And I'm excited to see what is to come over the next several years to see more of us in this space, because I've been to plenty of conferences and a lot of times I'm the only person that looks like me there. So, women and minority. And I'm excited to see that, the last conference that I went to, there were several of us there and they were running things. They were, C-suite employees. And that was exciting. And that's what I've seen change. Tons of more progress to go. But I've definitely seen in even just a short period of time, some significant changes.
Yeah, I would agree with Sabrina too on this, except being of a bit of a more advanced age and having 30 years, more than 30 years in this business, I can tell you that in the beginning, there weren't any women. And I actually shared with these ladies when we were chatting about this particular topic earlier this week, that back in the early 90s, the first time I went to China, not only did I not see other Americans, I definitely didn't see women. You did not see women in any type of supervisory, managerial, or leadership position throughout Asia Pacific or Latin America. And I know Sabrina and Parisa and the group has traveled a lot. That has changed drastically. Which is really encouraging. But to Sabrina's point, there are still women lacking in leadership, that we actually at the senior level, from executive vice president to like a CSEO, that number has slightly declined last year even. It was only a couple of percentage points, but it's a decline there. And while there are more women in the managerial positions, there's also more of an exodus at those mid-management positions because two key reasons. One, lack of opportunities for them to advance, and then lack of development opportunities. So I think those are really, those are areas where we really need to have a lot of focus and make sure that we're drawing a lot of attention to both the opportunities and the development.
The only other thing I would add is there's more conversation like this happening, which is great. And so just like Carol mentioned, we know that there's still significant gaps that need to be closed, but the fact that we're more openly talking about them and companies are taking more kind of public goals around it is great. And the other piece is there's a lot more innovation happening in the supply chain industry today, way more technology than I think there ever was before. And this was a part of the industries that exist in the world that didn't have much innovation. And so by nature of opening up how invention happens in supply chain, we're seeing more women with technical backgrounds being able to be a part of the conversation, which is great.
Yes, and that's definitely my personal experience as well, coming from the tech background into the supply chain industry only till very recently in the past 4 years. So it's really promising to see the change that you've described, you all have described. Moving on to the next question. In your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges women face in the supply chain industry, and how can these be addressed? Carol, maybe you'd like to start us off?
Sure. I think it's a little bit of like legacy thinking and practices. You get accustomed to things operating a certain way. And this is also beyond supply chain that, well, your experience is in this area, so that's your lane that you're going to stay in. Right? So then the idea of bringing women into those positions that perhaps maybe haven't had, extensive or any supply chain experience is one that's kind of a hurdle we have to get over. And I think we've also had a tendency to take more of a one-dimensional approach to supply chain. I think Parisa made a great point about technology and how that's driving some change in that, because you cannot look at it as it's not a linear thing. It's not one dimensional. There are multiple stakeholders, multiple business partners in a supply chain. There are a lot of things moving parts through a supply chain. So we really need to encourage diversity in the supply chain. And I think a couple of things would help with that. Again, I'll go back to what Parisa said, that we're talking about it more. So there's a lot more policy making going on with relationship to diversity. It's just not being put into practice at the pace that I think we need it to. So you can implement diversity policy, but you have to have that being, you have to have ambassadors all over your network to carry that through, I think, and really start kind of helping women punch above their weight class, give them that opportunity to do that. So I think, I think those are some of the things that are the challenges in getting over that type of legacy thinking, and really understanding that this is a big time of change.
I love that punch above their weight class. I'm going to use that. That's so good. And I think just to pile on to what Carol's saying, because I agree with all of it, it cannot be women who are driving the change. It has to be a collective, intentional effort driven from the top down. And it has to be not just in how we introduce women into organizations or put them in leadership positions. The environments that we work in every day have to become more inclusive. So I'm excited to see some of that progress start to change, but it's going to take time and a lot of determined effort. And the other, just speaking from my own personal experience, is imposter syndrome. It is so freaking hard every day to get the courage to speak up when I was often the youngest person in the room as well as the only woman in the room. And that's hard. But to overcome that fear and anxiety, you constantly have to remind yourself that you're in the room for a reason. You're at the table because you're entirely capable to be there. But we oftentimes find that women want to be perfect before they open their mouths. And it's something that we have to overcome.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think we tend to think that we need to be perfect. We tend to think that perfect bar is what's set for everyone, but it's not. We need to definitely lean a little more into our abilities to rise to the occasion versus what we know already before we come into the room. So I definitely think the unlock here is representation. Everything that Carol and Parisa both said, we need representation because that's what's going to bring more women into the supply chain. It's the knowledge and and seeing yourself in the people at the table and seeing yourself in those leadership positions. That's what's going to bring that draw. And right now, I mean, like I said, I fell into supply chain, but it was because no one was talking to me about it when I graduated college. No one was offering me any roles in that space. No one was saying, hey, this is the direction you should go. That was, hey, you went to Georgia Tech, but do you want to go into event planning? That's, while I was great, and that's another story for another day in college, but definitely not where I needed to be now. And again, just opening those doors, we can open them, but everyone else has to open them as well. And we need to have that commitment from the majority in the room, whether it's women, minorities, et cetera, to open the doors for other people to come in so we can get that representation. That's the only way we're going to get the diversity of thought that we need.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of something that I think that the group talked about was being pigeonholed potentially, right? Just didn't know if anybody wanted to double down on that.
Yeah, I think it's been a challenge actually, even in leadership positions where for certain roles that in departments that I was responsible for, that maybe I didn't do the direct hiring, but I needed to influence people to say, can we start thinking a little bit outside of the box? I'll use sales as an example. I was a big advocate for not bringing, somebody with 20 years of sales experience into the role because, oh, they bring this book of business. I don't know if that book of business is profitable or not. I don't really care. What I'm looking for is the type of person who has more business acumen than sales or logistics or acumen, right? And I think getting people to overcome that idea, but only somebody who's been in sales or somebody who's been in this area can do this is really tough. And it's particularly prevalent, I think, in supply chain. But the good news is that there is now such a lack of talent. I think more than 50% of supply chain organizations say that they don't have access to talent, and driving with things like that, increased focus on digitalization and technology, you're going to have to give these people a chance to in different areas that are going to bring that different perspective. So, you look at someone like Sabrina who's saying, I want more. I want to see more. That's the person I want to bring in. And she may not be, I'll use what you shared one other time, Sabrina, about customer service. You learn something from that person in customer service, right? Supply chain touches everything. You can take someone from any department and they're going to have something meaningful and relevant to contribute within supply chain.
Yeah, and to your point, Carol, I know when we were talking before, we were talking about being pigeonholed, and customer service is one of those areas that you'll see women rise and they'll get pigeonholed in that space. And customer service is a hard job. So to that point, when I think of trying to hire in my group and in the transportation/logistics function, I'm looking for grit. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not necessarily looking that you have a huge portfolio of doing a ton of transportation specific work. And where better place to get grit than customer service, right? When you're dealing with, especially if you're talking directly to a consumer. So being pigeonholed, that women have been pigeonholed in certain areas of the supply chain in certain industries. And I think the diversity of that thought coming from those spaces, even like Parisa said, coming from the innovation sector and coming from the technology space, that's what supply chain needs. And on top of that, then bringing those women in and removing that pigeonhole type of mentality and saying, hey, these women are going to be effective and rock stars in this space. That's, I think, we need to break down those walls and stop with the pigeonholing of, oh, well, they'll be great over here. They'll be a good people manager because of this. And all women are created differently. Bring different things to the table. So again, like if I'm looking for somebody, I'm looking for grit. And how I define grit is not necessarily how it would traditionally be defined on paper.
That's what you just said is so critical to making inclusive environments. I remember when I joined operations, nearly a decade ago, grit was defined by like who could work the longest hours and like be on the floor all the time and travel across the world. And as now a mom of 2 young children, I've learned so much about the barriers for working women in kind of the business world, let alone the operations world. And so I think building those inclusive environments that are cognizant of the fact that we all have a lot of responsibilities in our lives. And oftentimes childcare falls on women, even when you have very supportive partners. Understanding and evolving the word grit and kind of what good looks like in an ops role, I think is going to be a really critical point of kind of evolving this industry and making it more inclusive as well.
There's no more productive demographic than working mothers. I'm not one, 100%. So I can say that. I've had the privilege of having many working mothers on my team, and I know they can handle anything.
2 kids.
Totally.
2 kids is definitely a different level of grit.
Well, I
2
think
kids
that
and a conference call.
Exactly.
I think that segues nicely to the next question, which is, what advice would you give to women who are thinking about or just starting out in the industry? Can you give us an example of when and how you effectively advocated for yourself? What was the outcome? Parisa, let's start with you.
Sure. So, like I mentioned earlier, I entered operations when I was very junior in my career, and I came from a traditional product role in a space that had nothing to do with ops. I was in Kindle, and I was immediately cognizant once I joined ops that there weren't many women in the room, even at a company that was fairly diverse that I worked at. But not only were there not very many women, what was kind of stark to me was I was now working with operators who were often loud male voices. And that made it incredibly intimidating to leave my mark in meetings, especially meetings with very senior audiences. But I feel very fortunate that I worked for a company that operated with data as the paramount factor to making decisions. And I use the term data very loosely. I don't just mean financials and numbers, but it was more just understanding your customers' needs, which is true across all industries. If you want to be successful, you need to know what you're building and why. And when I found that when I brought the data, people of all levels listened. And that slowly gave me the confidence to speak up amongst the loud voices and eventually be heard. And in general, when I give career advice, I attribute much of my success, particularly in this industry, to the fact that I invested the time to understand my customers' needs deeply. And I leveraged that data to drive the direction of our product and operations strategy. And so when you're equipped with these kinds of facts, which all of us naturally should be to do our jobs well, and when you have a work environment that cares about the customer, I'd urge anybody who's new to this industry or even new to a job just to practice trusting yourself and speaking up, even when it can be terrifying, because it just gets easier with time. And you already have, again, the capabilities. You've been given that job because you had what it takes to do it well. And you just have to ground yourself in knowing kind of what does my customer need. And from there, the rest kind of works itself out.
Yeah,
I think.
Go ahead, Sabrina, please. No, go ahead.
Well, so I was just going to say, Parisa, absolutely. And I think one of the things I would tell my younger self in conjunction with that is invest in yourself. Part of that is investing in your own growth and but invest in yourself. That, the dividends that pays, we talk about 401k and invest in yourself, and that's probably advice that I would give women across the board, whether it's as a mom or just in corporate America. Don't forget to invest in yourself. You've got to put on your oxygen mask first, so invest in yourself. And a big piece of that is data. Numbers are a common language. So when you're in those spaces and you're not sure how to connect, or you're trying to find that common ground to have a conversation with someone that thinks differently than you, numbers are going to be that. And for me, one of the biggest and most powerful pieces of advice a mentor gave me was to really understand the financials. How does what you do impact the financials? And once you understand that, then it makes you a better decision maker, but it also helps you have higher level conversations, even with different levels of leadership. But that higher level conversation, you're always talking to the company's bottom line.
I love that you talked about the investment in ourselves, because that's so true. There will never be a greater return on investment than that one investment alone. If women do that, if they're investing in themselves. So, well, Parisa was right in saying that when you talk about, when I mentioned like having ambassadors around the network that are really championing, women in leadership positions, or, engagement of women and collaboration with women on the supply chain side or within their business as a whole. can't be represented. This shouldn't just be represented by women. Women do have the responsibility to invest in themselves, and I think they also have the responsibility to get out there and learn what they can in other areas. That poke your head where it doesn't belong. Start learning. Be curious about other departments. See if you can get on projects. That's one way. And again, talking about imposter syndrome, and when you do get pushback, because you'll get pushback, that's just the way it is, not to let that quiet you or take away your confidence. This is going to happen. And the more that you shut down after that, then the more that it says, well, you're not confident in your opinions. You're not ready to share it. So yes, data, knowledge, data, facts really help. And data sometimes scares people. This is a group of women that is really accustomed to data, but you've got, again, some legacy thinking where data maybe is in technology isn't that. So you have to understand how to speak that language also, and make sure that your message is resonating with various types of opinions and stakeholders, that you're kind of saying the same thing 5 different ways so that everybody truly understands what you're trying to get at. And not to minimize data, because I live and breathe off of data, but the most important thing for me is to always understand what is driving the results, what is driving the performance, because that is a whole other conversation to have with people about impact. So that was a lot covered on that one question.
Yes, and I definitely agree with all of the above, and especially just around staying curious, right? So whether it's staying curious about your customers' needs, curious about where that data came from, and then how to leverage that to advocate for yourself. I think those are really sound pieces for anybody listening on the call, not just women. How can leaders, especially male leaders, because it's no secret that this is a heavily male-dominated industry, better support and promote gender diversity in the supply chain industry? What are some of the programs or day-to-day actions that you've seen make an impact? Sabrina, why don't we start with you?
So I know us 3 ladies, we talked this when we got together the first time, but a big piece of it is advocacy. And it's advocating for me when I'm not in the room. So, opening the door to make sure that my opinion is heard in a meeting, that's really critical, but advocating for me when I'm not in the room. When my name is not brought up about an opportunity, throwing my name out there and making sure that, my interests are met as well, and making sure to be that advertising arm for my skill set in a way that your male counterparts may not need. So it may feel a little different and it may feel a little forced, but advocating for me as strongly as you can. And I think the one responsibility that I say I would have, or all women have in their careers, also to then make sure that they are comfortable to their mentors or their advocates for themselves. Tell them what you need. Tell them what you want, so that when they're in there advocating, what they're advocating for, what you want. Because I do think a lot of times women will be like, well, I'll go wherever they think I'm good. No, tell them what you want. Where do you want to be? If you don't want to be in global transportation because you don't want to travel, because that's not what you'd like to do, then you want to be over here. Have somebody who's advocating for you when you're not in the room, but make sure that you control that message so that your voice is heard in the way that you want it heard.
And I think on that, a lot of people talk about mentorship, which puts a lot of onus on the woman to find a mentor, make sure they match, know what to ask the mentor. But what Sabrina's talking about is called sponsorship. And it's like, you need mentors, of course. I'm not downing the fact that people should have mentors. They totally should. But sponsorship really up-levels the capability of opening doors for particularly underrepresented minorities, females included. And I think that's a really key distinction that's important to think about, because mentorship gets a lot of light, but what she's really talking about is sponsorship. And I totally agree with it happening out when you're not in the room. I've also had really specific examples in my career where influential male voices in the room would seek out my feedback. Dave Clark, my current boss, is a fantastic example. When I was very junior at Amazon and he was very senior, he would seek out my expertise on various topics in front of others. And what that would do was not only make room for me in a crowded room, but would kind of, when likely I was too nervous to do that myself, but it would amplify my point of view. And that kind of branding resonated and would help me continue to advocate my point of view in other venues as well. And now, as a senior leader myself, I love having the opportunity to use my voice to open doors for others, amplify diverse voices, sponsor others who are trying to make it in this space.
Yeah, I mean, that advocacy is so important, both starting for yourself, like Sabrina, like you said, share what you want, and it doesn't have to be, I think, again, we sometimes as women have a tendency to feel apologetic for what we're about to say. I learned to lose that a long time ago. That's the one thing about having done this for plus 30 years, you finally let that go. But it is, and here's why I would be good in this environment. And that's also another thing that we're not maybe necessarily accustomed to doing, is explaining why we're good. But if you go back to the data, the facts, like here's what my performance has been, here's the value that I delivered, here's what I've done in terms of client development and bringing new and creative ideas to the customers. Having those conversations, it's not egotistical, it's just stating facts. This is what was accomplished. But you also do need to then have that sponsor. And I think a good example, I'll use Lenovo. There's a woman, Carolina de la Paz, who's the transportation manager, and she's based in Mexico for Lenovo. And women in logistics is very important for her. She noticed within Lenovo, there weren't a lot of females in middle to upper management. And she talked to the head of global logistics, Gareth Davies, about that. And she created this forum, Women in Logistics, where she invites other women in from different companies, leadership positions, to talk about relevant topics going on in the industry today and what women's roles are in it. So what she's done is, really now she's globalized this, because she'll also do regional meetings within Europe or Latin America. And what Gareth Davies does, as the head of global logistics, is he shows up every single time. Right. So that's a great example of where Sabrina talked about, okay, this is me advocating for myself. This is me advocating for this, type of exposure, this type of conversation within the network, this type of change. And that's Gareth listening to that call. So the more that we can see those things happen across the board, I think the more successful all organizations are going to be.
Carol, I think you said two things that I think you said a lot of things that spot on, but two things that I think we as women sometimes forget. One is like my personal motto is ask for forgiveness, ask for permission, not forget it. Or see, it's my motto and I can't even say it, but ask for forgiveness.
I'd rather beg for forgiveness. Yeah.
Ask for
I'm
forgiveness.
very familiar with that.
See, and even no shouldn't stop you. Ask for what you want. But the other thing that you said too, and I found this to be very powerful, is brag about yourself. It's okay. Even if you call some of your friends and say, you know what, I am amazing. Like, take that time, because men don't feel the same level of shame in saying all these awesome things about themselves, and we shouldn't either. But bragging about yourself and being comfortable being able to do that, that's everything. And whether it's looking in the mirror before you go out on a date, or it's looking in the mirror before you go into a board meeting, be okay to brag about yourself and building that confidence within yourself, because the level of just stress and just the scrutiny we put on ourselves, sometimes society's not doing that. And we do it to ourselves sometimes. But totally agree, and I know it's not necessarily what an ally should do. They've got to do a lot more heavy lifting, but I definitely think we should be comfortable bragging about ourselves with our mentors, with our sponsors. Be comfortable, because what we've done is awesome. So we should be able to say it and be comfortable in it, and not feel bad or feel like we should apologize for it.
I love that. I know we're always encouraging, our colleagues to celebrate small wins, but celebrating those small wins for yourself, and talking out loud about it. last question, last moderated question before we get into some questions from the audience, but you're all incredible leaders, and it's a testament not just to your own success, but also just shows that women are more than capable of leading and driving our industry forward. If you were advocating for a career in supply chain to another woman, what would you say? What are some of the big opportunities for women to lead in this space? Carol, why don't we start with you?
Okay, part of me wants to be facetious and say run far, run fast, because it is very hard to get that balance that Parisa was talking about. But really, I'm totally joking about it because I've been doing it for so long. And this is such an amazing industry or space to be in. Even if you look at how it operates today, if you're looking from forecasting to final consumption, again, think about all the different stakeholders that are involved. You're talking about, sourcing, procurement. You're talking about logistics, trade compliance. You're talking about tax, finance, legal, operations, you name it. If you're in that, you're touching all these things, plus also suppliers, contract manufacturers, all other kinds of business partners. This is a learning ground for so much. I mean, you spend time in supply chain and you develop your skills and your knowledge and your ability to collaborate and engage with all of those stakeholders effectively. You have just laid the groundwork to run a company or to run your own business. You're more than 50% there, at least on supply chain side. And then I would further add, what I addressed earlier is that there is a total lack of talent and skill for supply chain as it exists today. And then start thinking about Industry 4.0 and change. I mean, I'm sure Sabrina can talk a lot about that and how that's changing, even with how that's impacting an organization like Clorox and any other type of manufacturing organization. So when you talk about the digitization, digital manufacturing, and that another space where there's lack of skill, you're talking about all the technology with AI, digital twins, looking at scenario planning. COVID exposed how fragile our supply chains are. So to say that we're going to be going through a transformation is an understatement. You can be a participant within that and get a lot out of it. You can be a conduit within that and really get even more out of it. You can be a catalyst in that. I mean, that's exciting. When you start thinking about that and everything that you can learn from working within supply chain and how that could be applied. And I would tell you that it's like if I were approaching, college graduates, going back to Sabrina's story, nobody talked to me about this. I'd be hitting STEM candidates. I wouldn't just be going to, Knoxville to say University of Tennessee, tell me about your logistics and supply chain majors. It's like, I want STEM people. I want STEM candidates, right? That are going to bring what Parisa and bring that passion that she brings to it, saying, data's exciting, right? Supply chain is exciting. And you develop that grit, or you completely fall out of it, that you learn everything that makes a supply chain successful: resilience, agility, adaptability, strength, all of that, tenacity, all of those things that you describe an effective supply chain are the attributes you build within yourself. That is transferable to anything. So that is probably what I would say to women. And then I would go back to the investment piece. Actually, one thing that I would like to bring up, because it's related to your president and chief commercial officer at Flexport. I was listening to the interview the Cube did with Teresa Carlson, and something she said resonated with me. Because I've also done the same thing, where she said to go to Microsoft, she took a reduction in pay and many titles, right? And that to me goes back to what Sabrina was talking about. That's an investment in me. saying, do I like to take a pay cut? And that's a kind of a precarious position for women, because we're constantly challenging, like, are we being paid equitably, right, compared to our male counterparts? But for me, that was a great ballsy move. And clearly it worked out well for her. But that isn't it. Don't look at that as me taking a step back. That's an investment to say, this is what I'm going to learn. This is how I'm going to apply it. This is where I think it'll, value my personal growth. But more importantly, the more knowledge you gain, the more exposure you have to different things in your career, the more value you bring to your coworkers, to your employees, and to the customer. And the customers and the employees deserve that. I always have to think about, what value am I bringing to my team? And it's making those strategic decisions sometimes that aren't exactly easy, but long term, they're going to be really great strategic investments with a heavy return.
And I know we want to get to time. Can I just add one more thing? I think that I oftentimes get asked why I work in ops, particularly with a diverse technical background. And what Carol said, so critical. Supply chain literally makes the world go round. And so I actually find it as the sexiest job in the world. And so if women are on this call and are kind of looking around at CEOs or women in leadership positions that they find very inspiring, double click into their resumes. They oftentimes have operational experience. So just know you're in an industry that will bode lots of dividends for you in the long run.
Absolutely. When Carol said AI, Parisa, your whole face lit up. So, so you can tell that's your space.
I'm going to jump in because we've only got 5 minutes, and I want to actually ask you the next question. And feel free to weave in, what you're going to say, but just so that we can take one question from the audience, how have cultural differences impacted women in leadership roles? Any personal experiences? We know that one of the biggest challenges is affecting change globally and breaking down gender barriers. Thank you, Terry, for the question.
Okay, so I shared earlier that I grew up in the Virgin Islands, moved up to the Atlanta area. So from a cultural standpoint and just doing business and being a minority female who also did not necessarily grow up in an environment that is traditional to what I work in today. I think one of the ways that has worked for me is finding that common language and finding that common. So while it is heavier lifting, not all arenas that you're going to be in are going to be meeting you with open doors. So finding that common ground and meeting people where they are to find, okay, where do we have some likenesses and similarities so that you can get into the conversation. And globally, that's similarly. Whenever I go travel anywhere globally, I do some research onto where I'm traveling to, the cultural norms, what experiences I'd like to get when I'm there. I touch base with people that I'm going to meet with before I get there to plan out how I want to spend my trip, et cetera, to make that experience one that I can find to be profitable for me, right? Personally profitable, whether it's just money or if it's an investment in me. So I think when you're stepping into a space, you can't change that you may not have as many things in common or may not have the same experience as somebody, but at the core, we're all people, and you can find that common ground to then open the door to learning and creating that space and that connectivity. Once you find that connection, then I think the business is second. The business is second. That connection and that personal connection, the business is second to me. So I've never been in sales, and that's not necessarily, I love supply chain. I'm like, Parisa, it's the sexiest thing alive. But sales, I think when you're forced to make that connection, everybody should know how to sell themselves. And that's critical no matter what segment of the business you're in. I think I answered the intent of the question. But I think that once you make that connection, then the world is kind of your oyster as far as
I have to, if I may add, because I love what you said, Sabrina, that your preparation and then really understanding the culture, but also showing up. I mean, I can tell you within Latin America, as an example, when I worked down in the region, there were two different cultural elements dealing with. One was that on the sales side, they were more accustomed to being customer service people, not hunters, right? And then the second was, how do I get women up in management, because there were none. And so that required me showing up to talk to the the gentlemen who were heading the offices or the regions talking about why I felt certain women could go into that role and punch above their weight class, and making the commitment to show up for them every quarter, to go through a development plan with them to make sure they stayed on track. And once you get one in and they become successful, it has this really brilliant domino effect to it. But you have to show up and put your money where your mouth is and make that investment in the people. And that goes across the globe. And the more you do that, they're more grateful for that there in most parts of the world outside of the United States, right? Because in some ways we're a little bit more, let's say, mature with our placement of women in management. So I think there's an opportunity to really champion for some of those other areas of the world.
Well, amazing. I know we could probably stay on for hours, but we are at time. And so that concludes today's webinar. I would like to thank Parisa, Sabrina, Carol for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure chatting with all of you. Small reminder to please fill out our feedback survey before exiting. And thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day.